Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us. Hi, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins, and I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Tony Wynn, and we're here to reflect today on Advent. Tony, as we think about Advent and the idea of Jesus coming, we think about, Black Friday, we think of consumerism so often standing in the way. This is something you've reflected on at length. Do you want to just share a few thoughts about it?
Yeah, absolutely. This particular season of the calendar year, I think, is absolutely busy for pastors and for families, but more so for pastors because we approach so many holidays. I recently gave or preached a sermon on the idea that a joyful life is a life lived in the presence of God, and we really tried to hunker down on the theme that, man, it's the life of God that really anchors us during this time of year, not necessarily anything else during this time of the year, but our focus is on the life of God and what He's given to us in Himself. And so when I think of Advent and I think of the time that we find ourselves in, that's where my heart is drawn towards. That's where my mind is drawn towards, the life that God has given us in Himself.
So the idea of God has given us His life that can easily be displaced in our focus on getting gifts, on buying things, none of which is bad in of itself. Right. They're good things. However, they can easily eclipse or displace what Christmas is all about, Advent, Christ coming to earth, and that God shares His life. It's God's presence, it's God's life, God with us, as Matthew's Gospel says, God with us, absolutely. Emmanuel.
Yeah.
So if we could reflect further on that theme of what does it mean for Christmas being about God with us and God sharing God's life with us.
Right. I think from a pastoral perspective and standpoint, that's something even in our conversation earlier that I'm really struggling and wrestling through is, one, we don't want to push people towards a commodification of this time of the year where everything is just transactional, where the gifts are the focus and not necessarily the person who's giving the gift. But on the other side of that is, like you said, we don't want to shame the act of gift giving. We don't want to condemn the act of gift giving, because there is a profound beauty and relational aspect to the act of giving gifts. And so I think that's where I'm struggling and finding the tension and moving is, one, we don't want to hyper focus and individualize the act of giving a gift where we lose sight of the person, but two, we also don't want to critique and condemn gift giving and how that all is situated within God giving us Himself during this time of year.
And so I think it's really important, even as we give gifts to people as Christmas comes, that we're always thinking not to look at the gift that we give or the gifts that we give as somehow replacing our sharing life with people. I think it's easy to kind of throw money at something, or throw money at someone, or throw gifts at people, and somehow use that as an escape from really sharing our lives. I'm thankful that when God gave us the ultimate gift of His Son, He shared His life with us. And that's really what Advent and Christmas is all about, that we make sure that in our giving of things, giving of, whatever it is that we are offering, that we always make sure that we're sharing our own lives with others.
Right.
It's God's presence and our presence with one another. And we'll think about that even in terms of what is, quote-unquote, salvation.
Right. And so, Paul, when you talk about God giving us the gift of Himself in His Son, and that there is an exchange that takes place, that there's this relational component that takes place. Could you elaborate further on that theme and that point of exchange in God giving us Himself?
Right. So, we like to exchange gifts with people. We give gifts to someone, they give gifts to us. So there's an exchange going on. I love how Martin Luther, in one of his early Reformation treatises, talks about the joyful exchange. the joyful exchange where Christ exchanges his righteousness for our unrighteousness. We find this also in the church fathers, like Athanasius and Irenaeus, where they talk about, he became like we, he became what we are, so that we might become what he is.
Absolutely.
So there's that exchange of Christ's life for our lives, so that we might participate
Absolutely.
in his life. It's not a thing, it's him, his righteousness, which is really his character. Salvation, or eternal life, is not some commodity.
Absolutely.
It's not something, it's someone. It's
Absolutely.
Christ himself. And so even Paul talks about this exchange that, and it's a radical change, this joyful exchange. Christ, again, as Luther said, he gives us his righteousness, and he takes on himself our unrighteousness.
Absolutely.
Our rags of filth he takes on, but we're clothed in his righteousness of his person, and of his own merits, as some might call it. And with that, I think, as I was going to say a minute ago, Paul talks about he who knew no sin
Absolutely.
became sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God. We become right. It's not something we have. We become it as we participate
Absolutely.
in his life. Or he became poor. He who was rich became poor, so that we might become rich.
Yeah.
So there's this exchange going on where Christ empties himself, he pours himself out rather, and we in our emptiness take of his fullness,
Absolutely.
and we participate in that fullness, that pleroma. That is, to me, such a profound mystery, namely Jesus Christ. And that's really what Advent is about, preparing for his coming, where he shares his life with us, exchanges his life, so that we might have that joyful exchange.
Absolutely. Paul, where I see Advent year-round is especially in youth ministry. There's this holy anticipation and this waiting of Christ to come. Not just Christ to come incarnationally through his birth, but Christ to come into the lives of our young people, the advent of Christ. When I look at ministry, and where my heart is at when I look at youth ministry, is this. I think for our young people, there is a desire and a passion for them to come to know our Lord. But in the midst of that, there is a potential commodification of our relationships with them. That the means is becoming their friend, engaging and living life with them, so that the ends is that they would come to know Christ. Not to say that Christ isn't the way, not to say that they shouldn't know Christ, but that's to say there's a commodification of that relationship. And so when you talk about exchange and Christ exchanging our poverty for his righteousness, how Christ takes on our death so that we can live into his life, and we look at ministry, my concern is I'm not living into that vision of Advent. I'm not living into that vision of incarnational exchange, because I'm so focused on, my students have to come to know Jesus, but I lose sight of that. No, it's the relationship itself that is the event. It's the place, ground, and setting for Christ to be present. But I'm so focused on them coming to know Christ that I lose sight of, what a gift that relationship is, and the exchange that takes place in that relationship. Could you touch base on that concern that I have?
Well, that concern you have is a concern I have for myself, and I think it's a concern that we should all have as Christians. We should have that passion to want to see people of whatever walk of life, whatever age, coming to know Jesus personally. We have to, though, in the midst of that rightful concern and rightful passion, not treat our own relationships with them as a means to an end of some, again, transaction. And that we really have to, one, trust in God, that God is at work. We need to believe that God is more concerned for people than we are ourselves for them.
Absolutely.
And I think just even having that confidence in Christ, we can take the pressure off of ourselves to somehow try and seal the deal.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's something that we always need to be mindful of, not to be about closing the deal, so to
Absolutely.
speak. And I think, even some of my friends of other faith traditions or no faith tradition at all, they're very wary of us as Christians at times that, we invite them out for coffee, and it's not really that we're getting together with them for friendship. It's more like
it's a bait and switch.
It's a bait and switch, and it's like we're inviting them to a Tupperware party, or inviting them to Amway or to Shackley, or whatever the case might be. Right. That it's really a means to an end of something else rather than to share life with them. And I think we always need to be having this barometer. Would I still want to be in relationship with this person if I knew that they were never to want to come to know Christ? Would I still want the relationship? And I think that to me is always a safeguard for me. Do I really care about them that much? And of course, I would hopefully care about them so much that I want them to come to know Christ. And yet, even if they don't, would I still want to be their friend? If not, that's a bait and switch. And I don't think that's anything other than a commodification. Even if there's a good concern, we've got to make sure that we don't commodify and treat the Christian life is something that we're inviting them into, or transaction. It's a sharing of life, as we've said over and over again.
And that's really reassuring to hear from you, Paul, as you and I live life together, because I consistently question my salvific state, and so hearing you say, man, you're committed to me regardless of where I end up, that's really helpful to know.
Hope it's mutual.
I hope
it's mutual.
Absolutely. I think that's such a profound and beautiful grounding point, that it's in that exchange. And that Christocentric focus where it's not ultimately our exchange, but it's Christ's exchange that propels us forward to also engage in an exchange to the relationship.
Absolutely.
And so that grounding is so beneficial, I think, in ministry, but also just in daily life.
Yeah, and again, as we live into Christ, His advent, His coming, He's the one who initiated in the first place. He cares more about all this than even we do.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to understand that we're on His coattails. We're on His shoulders. That it's the Father, Son, and Spirit. As Karl Barth will say, Jesus goes on this far journey. He's on His way to us. Advent. He's coming to us. He relates to us. The Father sends the Son in the Spirit to share life with us. So this is the way in which He shapes time and space that we might share life with one another.
Yeah. And so because you brought him up, speaking of the great doctor Karl Barth, my alias is Barthian. I won't give the whole address, but that's an alias I've picked up since my undergrad time at Multnomah, now into my seminary. And I think Barth is someone that we share a common interest in, you doing your dissertation on Barth. And Barth stands in this long line of tradition of the church fathers to the reformers and their attention that they've paid to Christ. Could you expound on Barth's influence and his Christocentric vision for life today and for the church?
Sure. I just have to say, they called me Karl when I was in seminary, because I was so really passionate about the study of Karl Barth's theology, but none of that compares to you having as part of your email address, Barthian.
It's a true millennial eschatological, digital vision is what it is.
I guess it is. So I don't know if you even had an email address, but I'm glad you do. Barthian is part of it.
I beat you to it.
So Karl Barth, born in 1886, died in 1968. Many have hailed him as the 20th century's greatest theologian. Swiss national, taught in Germany, and also taught in Switzerland. Much of his career was in Switzerland at the University of Basel. Also where Nietzsche, I believe, had taught. So two of my favorite figures right there.
Yeah.
Well, one the great philosopher, one the great theologian. And so Barth, as you're well aware, wrote luminously, and he said in some families they drink, in ours we write.
Absolutely.
And I don't think he ever stopped writing. He might have died writing, but wrote so many profound works. Just a few of them that are so well known is Romerbury for his commentary on Romans, the Epistle to the Romans, especially the second edition, that really was a bombshell on the playground, as it has been said, of classical Protestant liberal theology in the 19 teens or so. And then one of my other favorite works of his is the Barmen Declaration, which was more of a treatise, a manifesto, written around 1934 as a major confrontation in the face of Aryan supremacy,
Yep.
National Socialism, Adolf Hitler as he was on his rise.
Yep.
And then his most well-known work, or works, of course, are the Church Dogmatics,
Right.
which cover decades of his mature reflections. And so one of the things I love so much about Barth with his particular Trinitarian theology and the renaissance of Trinitarian theology that arises with Barth's thought is his Christocentric thrust that we were just alluding to earlier, immersed as he went back in after the Romer brief period, the Romans commentary period, his early thought. He started going back and investing energies in studying the Church Fathers. Absolutely. And the Reformers, and even medieval thought, Protestant scholastic thought, very immersed in the tradition of theology as well as in philosophy. And but this Christocentric thrust that shows up at every turn in the Church Dogmatics is so phenomenal to me, and perhaps we'll have an opportunity to engage it. One of my professors in seminary said that Barth was the defender of Chalcedon in the 20th century, namely a very high Christology doctrine of Christ as the Word who becomes flesh, the emphasis being on the Word. Some challenges, of course, in any theologian's work, and for him as well, but a really strong emphasis on high Christology. Yeah. Jesus looms large as the Word made flesh.
When we look at contemporary ministry, because Barth was not only a theologian, a world-class theologian, but he was also a pastor.
Right. Actually, he never had a formal doctorate.
Right.
He had honorary doctorates,
right.
But yeah, his whole theological journey really starts, as far as making this great splash, was
right.
from his pastorate in Zoffinville, Switzerland. Mm-hmm. He was called the Red Pastor,
yeah.
because of his engagement of social concerns, socialism, and the like, identifying with people, working class people, right. in this village. So he was always immersed in struggles of people.
Right.
And I think that's often lost in Barth's thought, but that's in part what shaped him. And it was a church dogmatics. It was right. a theology to the church with concern for the church, not alien to the church.
Absolutely. And that leads me to where I'm contemplating and wrestling in active ministry is, what is the import? What is the effect of a high Christology for a day-to-day life of the church and of the pastor and of the congregation? I think exactly what you said about Barth. He was concerned about the day-to-day struggles of his people. It wasn't from an ivory tower. It wasn't locked away in a study. But it was because of his concern. Or rather, it was his high Christology that propelled his concern for Absolutely. His people. Could you talk about ways you see a high Christology really taking shape and form and groundedness in our contemporary culture and in our church today?
Well, if I could start out with Barth in that regard, he started his days listening to Mozart's music. So aesthetics, music, and just his fascination with Mozart. I love reflecting on his little book on Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and just how much his theology, in some respects, is shaped by his understanding of Mozart, and how it gave rise to certain Mozartian renditions in theology, but also political writings. He was very much immersed in political reflections and wrote on politics, and was well versed in political concerns in his day, both regionally, nationally, in the European context, and globally. So he was always concerned, whether it's the arts or the matter of politics. It wasn't just theology, but it was for him always from the vantage point of taking Jesus seriously, and what import does Jesus have as Jesus of Nazareth, Absolutely. The Word enfleshed, in terms of all domains. And I did my work on Barth and the cultivation of a theology of culture, the Word of Christ, World of Culture, Sacred and Secular through the theology of Karl Barth, under the mentorship of Professor Colin Gunton in London, King's College London, and just always fascinating, one, with Barth's work and also Gunton's work, but just the idea of thinking through what's the import of theology for the church and contemporary culture. And so I just wanted to mention how Barth himself was attuned. He's often not seen as being concerned for culture, but often anti-cultural.
Right.
His theology, just like anyone's theology, arises in a cultural context and engages cultural cultural context. So we'll have opportunity as we proceed here to talk more about what's the import of theology, Barth's theology, or theology in general, for our cultural context and church context.
Absolutely. This isn't necessarily in our show notes, but you brought something up that I think is of vast importance to our listeners and to the church at large is politics. This is to say, in our earlier episode, our first episode, you had said Jesus is more conservative than conservatives and more liberal than the liberals. And as we look at how contentious past elections within the United States have been, and how contentious this past election has been as we head into another election year, and we are unpacking this Advent theme, this incarnational grounding for life, for ministry, how does this exchange take place for us politically as we head into 2020 and another election year? This is to say, I think generational differences, I think ethnic differences, socioeconomic differences sometimes hold us apart. Those differences cause division and they keep us apart. But what does Christ's exchange, what does the incarnation have for us when we look at that divide? And in concrete terms, politically heading into 2020, what does Christ's exchange have for us when we look at that divide, whether it's liberal, conservative, Democrat, or Republican?
Well, I certainly think those concerns that people have are real concerns, and we shouldn't demean or disrespect people really taking seriously their political convictions. And I think there's a lot at stake with some of the concerns. For myself, as someone who's very passionate about immigration reform issues and the like, those things aren't to be taken lightly, and no doubt we'll have opportunity to discuss those matters in the future. I do think when we account for the biblical reality of the unassuming person of Jesus of Nazareth, how he came to earth, people missed him. People missed him, and we can miss him even in the midst of really important concerns. I do not want to demean people's passionate concern for political issues, but I think Christ always takes it from another angle and intersects, and always in a way that he's going to change, in some ways, transform the conversation.
Right.
So the unassuming nature of Jesus Christ, how he comes, I think so often we're presumptuous. We tend to think we're always the ones in the right. Whoever is not with us, they're the unrighteous ones.
Absolutely.
And again, I don't think all cats are gray on these matters. So it's again, not to say, it doesn't really matter, let's be agnostic. And I fear because of the political rancor that we so often see, a lot of people, maybe younger people, get disillusioned with political concern. I think they need to be more engaged, not less engaged.
Right.
But I think the lack of civility is deeply problematic, and I think we have a lot of self-righteousness.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Jonathan Haidt's work, the social psychologist, who talks about basically that we have this problem with self-righteousness in our society, and he, as an atheist, though sees religion as very helpful, he sees in Jesus someone who has much to offer in terms of what I'm going to call enemy love, humility, take what I'll call the redwood forest out of our own eyes before we take the toothpick out of someone else's eye, just so that we can enter into real conversations, engage our political differences in the best possible terms, even as Lincoln said, the better angels of our nature, to engage in real debate, but always open to being transformed by the encounter. And I think Christ, because of his unassuming nature, it's easy to miss him, and also to think, I've got him down.
Yeah.
We never have him down.
Yeah.
The question is not, do we ever master divinity? You know, I have a Master of Divinity degree. The question is not, have I mastered divinity?
Right.
But has divinity mastered me? And I think
Right.
the unassuming nature of Christ helps us, hopefully, to think through, what do I need to learn in any particular conversation? Jesus always had to have his sleeping bag in between Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector,
Right.
because Simon the Zealot, anti-tax collector, anti-Rome, he was a zealot. He wanted to bring down the Roman establishment. Matthew, former tax collector, traitor, both are called into Jesus' inner
Absolutely.
circle, and Jesus is the one who somehow mediates those incredible tensions in a way that he becomes the point of connection. Somehow, some way, to move beyond partisan divisions where we see ourselves as always in the right, the other always in the wrong, to really think through, you know, maybe I don't see things perfectly. Maybe I need to be less presumptuous, more unassuming, and hopefully the other side is as well, so that we can enter into real conversations and not just, you know, Twitter feed, you know, one-offs or bumper stickers, but really profound exchanges where we move beyond disgust and the theme of, you know, just people are sickening to me, to really see what do we have to learn from one another as we
Absolutely.
press into these issues.
Absolutely. Paul, when we talk about engaging in a relationship with people that we disagree with,
Which is hard.
absolutely.
I mean, it's hard.
Absolutely. We're sitting here today. No.
That's right.
But what I want to say to that is, often the word incarnational is used as such an umbrella
Yeah,
term.
it's a buzzword.
Right.
Yeah.
That if we engage in some sort of relational interaction that's incarnational, in some ways we water down the majesty of the incarnation and the implications of the incarnation and the exchange that takes place in the incarnation, because as long as we're in a relationship, that can be titled as incarnational. How do we, from a place of high Christology, a high view of the work of Christ and the historicity of the work of Christ and that exchange, how do we not lose the majesty of the incarnation and what it means for us when we sometimes ministerially and practically sum it up to, oh, I'm in a relationship with somebody, I'm incarnational.
Well, if I can go back to the whole theme of politics for a minute, you know, just when I think about the high majesty of Christ, that he looms large, it reminds me of, and I've never been asked to speak on the 4th of July, and if I were, I'd be speaking from, you know, the encounter between Joshua and the captain of the Lord's army when he's about to go in and conquer Jericho, and he sees this imposing figure. Some will say in the history of the church that captain of the Lord's army is a pre-incarnate form of Jesus. But Joshua looks up and sees this awesome figure and says, whose side are you on?
Yeah.
And the figure who is called the captain of the Lord's army looks at Joshua and says to him, I'm neither on your side or their side. This is holy ground, take off your sandals. And I think so often we think God is on our side.
Yeah.
And the question is never, is God on my side? The question is, am I on God's side? And I think when Jesus, even in his unassuming posture, is always someone who looms large and that he must be the one who frames the narrative, not us, I think that always should cause us to enter into exchanges humbly, that even ministerially as we engage, you know, we participate in his life or not. We cannot conjure up ministry. So I don't ever like the language of that I'm incarnating Christ.
Right.
I think that's problematic language. There's one incarnation, according to Christian Orthodoxy, Jesus himself.
Absolutely.
But through the Spirit we participate in his life. So I don't think we ever take up where he left off.
Yeah.
You know, Sun Myung Moon supposedly said, I've come to finish what Jesus began. I don't finish what Jesus began.
Right.
Hopefully I'm continuing to participate
Absolutely.
in what Jesus continues to do. Like in the book of Acts. In my former book, Theophilus, I spoke of what Jesus began to do and teach. The implication is not that Jesus has gone and left us for good, but now through the Spirit, Jesus continues to do, continues to teach, continues to lead, continues to pour out his Spirit, or God pours out the Spirit in and through Christ, just as Christ was poured out in and through the Spirit.
Absolutely.
So that this idea that, you know, again, It's Jesus who continues to do his work
Right.
in our midst through the
Right.
Spirit.
That's so good. Something that Dr. Damani Pothin, who teaches here at Multnomah University, said one time in chapel that I've always held on to, that I think plays into the theme that we're developing here, is even in our well-meaning ideas of justice and our pursuit of justice, that justice still falls short of God's justice. And I think that plays into what you were saying with our ideas of righteousness, because ultimately we can be blind by our own ideas of righteousness, and it turns into self-righteousness. But there's something to be said about Christ bringing together Simon and Matthew, that their perspectives and predispositions regarding righteousness ultimately found an intersection in the person of Christ. And that's not that we're doing necessarily a new work of Christ, but we're doing a fresh work of Christ because we're continuing to participate in the work of Christ.
Through the Spirit.
Absolutely. And when we look at our politics and our political views, it's not how are we right and how are we righteous, because we all operate from a place of man, our convictions are correct and true, or else we wouldn't be holding to those convictions. But how do we exchange convictions or experience a greater conviction or a truer reality in the person of Christ and in our relationship with others despite our disagreements? I'm so profoundly convicted and moved by the sheer fact that, man, my righteousness falls so short of Christ's righteousness, but he exchanges that for me. That my riches and my, however decadent my clothing or my robes may be, they're still rags in comparison to what Christ is giving me. And to live life from that place of humility. And it's so freeing, because it's not that I have to become humble, but it's that in living life with Christ, he teaches me to be humble, and there's an exchange that takes place.
Right. I mean, it was just, this last week or 2 weeks ago. And again, regardless of where we are in the political spectrum, let me just allow this to be brought forth as an entry point into what we're discussing in terms of humility and ultimately enemy love. You know, there was a reporter who asked Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, do you hate the president? And she said, I'm a Catholic, I don't hate anyone.
Yeah.
And again, people are going to take, sides on what do you make of that comment, what do you make of the president, what do you make of the Speaker of the House. I'm more thinking about, as a Christian, she says, as a Catholic, I don't hate anyone.
Yeah.
Well, let me go back several decades to a Christmas sermon from Martin Luther King Jr. As you know, I'm finishing up a Trinitarian social ethics for InterVarsity academic, and I have immersed myself in King's thought, and I'm just really struck by this Christmas sermon he gave just months before his death in 1968, where he talks to his enemies. He says, though you hate us, though you destroy our homes, you kill our children, thinking about all the mayhem and what had been caused. He said, though you have done all these things to his enemies, he speaks, yet we will love you. And that enemy love, which is only that's what marks Christian love, which I don't have that love in myself for anyone, especially my enemy.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, that Christ would call us through his Spirit, through God's Spirit, to love our enemies. That's distinctively Christian love.
Right.
Not to hate, but to love. When King says, in the end, we will win a victory. It'll be a double victory because we will win you over. We're not going to win over against you. We're going to win you over to this cause for beloved community. And I just think, that's what Christmas is about. That's what Advent is about. And as Jesus exchanges the gift of his life for us, he moves toward us in such a way that he takes our hatred toward others, toward God and toward others, and maybe even hatred of self, and replaces it with his love. As St. Francis said, where there is injury, pardon; where there is hatred, love. Forgiveness. Though we might be more concerned to forgive than to forgive. To be forgiven. To forgive rather than to be forgiven. To understand rather than to be understood.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of radical exchange that only comes about as God pours out Christ and pours out the Spirit into our lives, that it's even possible for us to do, because we don't have that in of ourselves.
Absolutely.
I can't make that happen.
Yeah, and that's so beautiful, because even in that exchange, when Christ exchanges his love to us and he takes upon himself our hatred, our bitterness, our angst, he doesn't become hateful. He doesn't become bitter.
Mm-hmm.
But he consumes it, and he doesn't allow it to consume himself.
Right.
And
he brings an end to it in his own person.
Yeah, and we continually can go to Christ because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that exchange isn't a one-time exchange. It's a continual relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That in our being saved, it's not just a one-time, Jesus, here, take my sin, and now I am forever sinless. But in this life, it's a continual exchange where we can continually come before Christ.
And a continual dependence, a desperation for him to show up.
Absolutely. And that my prayer is that we head into further disagreements with that predisposition and that posture. That even in that disagreement, what is being exchanged? Because it can't just be vile words. It can't just be the disagreement that's the exchange. But that we would arrive at a conclusion, however massive the disagreement may be, that the conclusion is not enemy love, just enemy love, but that person really becomes a brother and a sister, despite our disagreement. Because I think that's what it is. It's from a place of enemy love that you move beyond them being an enemy, and the call is to see them as someone who's made in the image of God. And if they're made in the image of God, they can't just stay an enemy, but they have to be viewed as someone who is wonderfully and fearfully made in the image of Christ.
Inviolable worth in and through Christ. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that profoundly rocks my ministry. I operating from, more than operating, but living and pastoring from that predisposition, I think of how there are so many things that pastors disagree on, or deacon boards and pastors disagree on, or in youth ministry, parents and the youth pastor disagree on, or pastors and the youth, and the intersectionalities of disagreement. It's vast, and it's massive. In some ways it can be crippling. But to say, Christ calls me to love my enemy, and then he calls me to move beyond seeing them as an enemy, to see them as a friend. Because I once was an enemy to Christ, but he moved beyond seeing me as an enemy.
Amen.
He moved me to not only
Preach it.
become a child, but to become a co-laborer with him. I'm so profoundly grateful for his exchange and taking on that guilt and moving me forward. How else would you say, as we look at wrapping up this episode, how else would you say, heading into this Advent season and continuing reflections and contemplations on how Christ has become God with us, how else do you see us practically living into that presentness of Christ?
Well, as we mentioned before, the joyful exchange that Martin Luther talks about, in that same treatise he talks about we ascend to Christ by faith, not by our works. And that was his big concern, was that, how could I ever have the kind of love that God has? Because God's love is perfect. How can I ever have that kind of love? If union with God is through acts of love like God is love, I'll never be able to make it.
Right.
But then he realized it's not by our acts of love that we have oneness with God, but it's Christ's act of love as he comes into our lives. And so Luther came to realize with this joyful exchange, he also talked about Jacob's ladder.
Yeah.
That we ascend to Christ by faith, which is trust. Not some thing. Faith is not a thing. As Luther said, faith is an empty hand. We ascend to Christ by faith. We descend to our neighbor in love. Not in a condescending way, but it's as we come back from the throne room, if you will, caught up in Christ.
Absolutely.
That we now turn toward our neighbors, and we're to become little Christs to one another. That's Luther's idea. We become little Christ to one another, where we really truly love people from the heart. And it's only as the love of God is poured onto our hearts through the Spirit, as Romans 5:5 says, that we're able to truly love and free to love others. So I think, again, the love of Christ that shapes us is such that it moves us beyond looking to get something from someone.
Absolutely.
I think we can share things, but hopefully we're sharing our lives so that we don't treat either our Christian faith or the other as some object. We need to treat people, to use even Immanuel Kant's language. You need to go beyond looking at people as mere means, but to see them as ends in themselves.
Absolutely.
And I think in Christ, we no longer look at anyone from a human point of view. We don't use people. We don't go through the cash register line and look at the clerk as someone who's just there to, exchange with us so we get our stuff and move out. How to be present with Christ's presence in such a way that we look at that person, even at the counter, as having real worth and dignity, and they're not there simply to help me buy a product.
Absolutely.
My wife, my children, my friends, others, to not look at people as things or mere means to an end of getting my own benefits, but to see the relationship itself as what it's about is really key. And I think with us, if we can move beyond a culture of things to a culture of persons, to use King's language in his Vietnam War sermon, to move beyond a culture of things to persons, where you see people having value and we don't use them to get what we want, but see the relationship, that encounter, as what we're really about. That relation, because that relationship is itself sacred, and it's made sacred through Christ's presence in our midst.
Absolutely, and I think that's what New Wine, New Wineskins as a community is about. In our first episode, we talked about how we are a community focused and built upon that good news, that fresh news that takes shape and form in culture, in the world, that's not afraid to be present in the world. And how beautiful the incarnation is, that propels us as a community, as a New Wine community, to be present in culture, to be present in the church,
and to be stretched in those relationships.
Absolutely. And the implications of the incarnation for discipleship, for the church, for church life is something that I look forward to continuing to discuss with you, and seeing how are we affected by a high Christology, where Christ isn't just some man, but he is God who has become a man. I so look forward to unpacking the implications of Christ's exchange and his taking on our rags and in exchange for his robes. And so with that being said, any closing statement for our viewers and listeners, Paul?
Well, just thank you so much for being with us, and Tony, thank you for tasting the new wine of Jesus with me. And I think that, my prayer and my hope is that it would never run dry, that we would always realize that our cup overfloweth in the midst of challenges. There's so much loneliness at Advent and Christmas. I think for us to always be sensitive to people around us, that Jesus was a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. And I think at Advent that we would be very mindful of how many people feel isolated and alone. And this man of sorrows, the God human, who is a man of sorrows, not that he rid himself of our struggles, but he takes our struggles to himself, as Athanasius would say in one of his writings, that he takes our mental struggles to himself. He takes our struggles to himself. He becomes one with us, and I think we need to make sure that that we're not desensitizing ourselves and being simply with our nuclear families and those closest to us, but always to be mindful of those who are often not accounted for, that Christ's presence, that we would share life with those in our midst, and to be sensitive to his presence. And he, in his unassuming way, will often be most present where we least expect him to be, in the face of the stranger, in the face of those who are often most lonely. We will find him there.
Amen. Thank you so much.